In January 1941, the British military moved Franz von Werra across an ocean, through Canada, and inside a guarded train, because 2 escape attempts in 2 different prisons hadn't been enough to hold him. He was out of the train and standing on a frozen river inside the same week. The Allied containment system had never modeled what happened next. To understand what broke, you first have to understand what the British believed they had built. By the autumn of 1940, the Allied POW containment system had been operating for 14 months. In that time, I had processed hundreds of captured German officers and developed, through trial and correction, a layered architecture that its administrators regarded with something close to institutional confidence. The camps were not single perimeter facilities. They were tiered. Physical barriers were backed by administrative controls, which were backed by transfer protocols, which were backed by escalation procedures for prisoners who proved too persistent. The system had an answer for every problem it had so far encountered. Guards were doubled at facilities that showed signs of testing. Interrogation pipelines were refined. When a prisoner demonstrated methodical behavior, systematic probing of the perimeter, repeated attempts, structured intelligence gathering, the standard response was escalation. Move the prisoner. Increase the distance. Remove him from any geography he had already mapped. The logic was clean, and within the boundaries of Allied-controlled territory, it worked. The system had one blind spot. It had drawn its map carefully across every jurisdiction it controlled, and stopped there. What lay beyond the edge of that map, it had not modeled. It had not needed to. Until January 1941, no prisoner had ever reached the edge. Franz von Werra was 26 years old in the autumn of 1940. He was an Oberleutnant in the Luftwaffe, a fighter pilot who had flown Messerschmitt Bf 109s during the Battle of Britain. He had been shot down over Kent on September 5, 1940, one of hundreds of Luftwaffe pilots down during that campaign, processed through standard British intake channels, and delivered to Grizedale Hall in the Lake District, which was at that point one of Britain's primary holding facilities for captured German officers. He was 26 years old, and he had been flying combat missions over England 6 weeks earlier. He did not intend to remain in a British prison camp for the duration of the war. What distinguished him from the many other prisoners who shared that intention was the method he applied to escaping. He did not improvise. He mapped. At Grizedale Hall, von Werra conducted his first escape attempt. It failed. He was recaptured, and the facility's security assessment was updated accordingly. The standard response followed: transfer. He was moved to a second facility at Swanwick, in Derbyshire. A different building, a different staff, a different structural configuration. The assumption behind the transfer was that a prisoner's escape knowledge was facility-specific. What worked at Grizedale would not work at Swanwick. At Swanwick, von Werra demonstrated that this assumption was wrong. Rather than probing Swanwick's physical perimeter the way he had probed Grizedale's, he approached the problem from a completely different angle. He fabricated an identity, presenting himself at a nearby RAF airfield as a Dutch pilot, claiming to have been separated from his unit. The cover story was designed to exploit a different structural assumption entirely, that a uniformed officer at an active airfield had legitimate reasons to be there. If the ruse had held, he would have reached an aircraft and departed England without triggering a single perimeter alarm. It did not hold. His identity was questioned, and the fabrication collapsed under scrutiny. He was recaptured. 2 attempts, 2 different facilities, 2 completely different methods. Each had targeted a different structural assumption of the containment architecture: the physical perimeter at Grizedale, the identity verification gap at Swanwick. MI9, Britain's military intelligence section responsible for POW management, was watching. What the record of those 2 attempts documented was not a prisoner improvising under pressure. It was a prisoner running a systematic intelligence operation against the system designed to contain him, identifying its assumptions one by one, and testing each for exploitable weakness. The system's answer, as it had always been, was escalation, but this time, the escalation was significant. Remove him from Britain entirely. Put an ocean between him and any conceivable return route. The SS Duchess of York departed a British port in January 1941 carrying, among its passengers, a cohort of German officers designated as high-security transfers. The decision to move this group to Canada was deliberate and formally documented. Britain had identified a category of prisoner for whom domestic containment carried unacceptable risk. Canada offered several distinct advantages. It offered geographic distance and Atlantic crossing between the prisoner and any European resistance network he might contact. It offered a separate administrative jurisdiction, meaning that any escape from Canadian custody would become a Canadian jurisdictional problem, managed under Canadian protocols, without the immediate access to European transit routes that a British escape might provide. And it offered a POW infrastructure that had not yet been tested against a prisoner who had already breached the British perimeter twice using two different methods. The British had run the logic carefully. You cannot escape to Germany from a country that is not adjacent to Germany. You cannot access a Luftwaffe airfield when the nearest German-held territory is an ocean away. The transfer was, by every measure of institutional reasoning available in January 1941, the correct response to the problem Franz von Werra represented. It was not the correct response. What it had not modeled was the geography between Canada and the United States, and, more specifically, what legal framework governed a German prisoner of war who crossed into that geography? Somewhere north of Prescott, Ontario, on a Canadian Pacific Railway train moving through January darkness, von Werra went out a window. Now put yourself on the bank of the St. Lawrence River. It is January in Ontario. The temperature is well below freezing, the kind of cold that turns exhaled breath to vapor before it has traveled 6 inches. You are a German Luftwaffe officer, wearing whatever you escaped in. The ground behind you is Canadian soil. The country behind you wants to return you to a prison camp. The river in front of you is not water. It is ice, wide, dark, groaning faintly under the temperature. On the far side is New York State. In January 1941, New York State was not at war. The United States had not yet been attacked at Pearl Harbor. American neutrality is not a political posture. It is a binding legal framework with very specific operational consequences for exactly the situation you are standing in. You do not know whether that framework will hold you as a prisoner or release you as a civilian. You do not know whether American officials have received instructions from the Allied chain of command or whether any such instructions exist. You are standing on a frozen river in January in Ontario, and the only thing between you and finding out is the ice. You step onto it. He crossed it on foot. On the far bank, von Werra was detained by American authorities. U.S. Immigration and State Department personnel were notified. Processing began. The Allied containment system, British designed, Atlantic reinforced, Canada extended, had now generated a question it had never been designed to answer. What is the legal status of a German prisoner of war who reaches neutral sovereign territory during wartime transit? American authorities processed von Werra properly and by the book. U.S. Immigration and State Department channels were engaged in sequence, as they would be for any irregular border crossing. The processing was thorough. The answer it produced was the same regardless of how carefully the procedure was followed. The governing legal framework was the existing body of United States neutrality statutes and the Hague Conventions on the treatment of prisoners of war. Neither instrument provided a mechanism for holding a German national as a prisoner of war in a country that was not a party to the conflict. The United States was not a belligerent. It was not a signatory to Allied POW agreements. It was not bound by the protocols under which Britain and Canada held their prisoners. There was no legal instrument, not a bilateral agreement, not an emergency protocol, not a wartime exception, under which American officials could transfer von Werra back to British or Canadian custody in a prisoner of war capacity. He was released. American officials did not assist him. They applied the law as it existed in January 1941. The gap was not in American willingness. It was in the architecture of a containment system that had drawn its map across every Allied controlled jurisdiction with care and precision, and had simply never extended that map to neutral territory, not because someone had overlooked it, because the system had never imagined a prisoner reaching it. Every system has a neutral country it forgot to model. Von Werra had found Britons. Von Werra traveled south through the United States to Mexico, and from there, via South America toward German-held Europe. The precise routing through the continent is not fully confirmed in available records. What is confirmed is that he arrived back in Germany and was received by the Luftwaffe as an operational asset. What followed was a formal debrief. Von Werra was questioned at length on his observations within the Allied POW and interrogation system, the intake procedures used at British facilities, the categories of questions applied during processing, the methods used to assess and classify captured airmen, and the physical layout of holding facilities. British post-war assessments tended toward minimizing the intelligence value of that debrief. What the documentary record does confirm is that Luftwaffe counter-interrogation doctrine was revised during this period, and that his return to Germany was classified and handled as an operational event rather than an administrative one. He was reinstated to active duty. He flew again. Von Werra's escape did not remain an embarrassment. It produced a documented institutional response. Allied POW transfer and handling protocols were formally revised in the aftermath. The specific vulnerability he had exposed, the absence of any provision for a prisoner reaching neutral sovereign territory during overland or inter-dominion transit, was directly addressed. Under revised coordination frameworks, the handling of high-risk prisoners during cross-Atlantic and overland transfers was restructured to account for jurisdictional gaps that the original architecture had not modeled. The classification criteria for prisoners designated as serial escape risks were revised upward, requiring higher-grade escort, restricted transit routing, and explicit protocols for any itinerary that passed through or adjacent to neutral territory. The broader finding embedded in those revisions was precise and unambiguous. Geographic distance does not constitute a security layer if the geography between transfer points contains sovereign neutral territory. That was not a principle extracted from theory or wargaming. It was a finding extracted from the documented failure of one specific transfer in January 1941. The revised protocols MI9 implemented remained in operational effect until the war's end. Franz von Werra was killed on October 25, 1941. His aircraft suffered engine failure during a combat patrol over the North Sea. He was 27 years old. He had been back in Germany for less than 9 months. Fed-POW system he had broken, tested twice in Britain, breached once in Canada, rendered jurisdictionally inoperable in New York State, outlasted him by 4 years. The revised protocols his escape forced into existence remained in operational effect until the end of the war. The doctrine he had exposed as incomplete was rewritten, hardened, and applied to every high-risk prisoner transfer that followed. The system he broke survived him. He did not survive it.